Welcome back to the Win with Dice podcast, a podcast featuring members of the Win with Dice team and continuing our Lancer Month event. Another guest from the Lancer community. I'm Calvin and I'm joined by Ramon.
Hey guys!
And this week we're also joined by Miles, writer of Castor and Pollux. Say hello.
Hi, I'm Miles. On Discord I go by Hella Spooks or the Cicada King. You can find the field guide to Castor and Pollux at cicadashellsoul.itch.io, as well as the other stuff I work on.
Yeah. We will have a link to the itch.io page below where you can go check out this setting that you can add to your Lancer game. It's got a few places you can go for a game. It's got some NPCs. It's got some mechs. It's got some NPC mechs. It's got some really interesting stuff that you can put into your game, or you can start a whole new campaign in that we are gonna get to talking about, especially the ship stuff. I'm really excited to talk about that because we did use a bit of that in our Lancer stream from last year.
Ooh, okay.
But before we get into all that, we have to get into the most important part of the show, the Win with Dice weekly GM tip of the week.
Yes, the Win with Dice weekly GM tip of the week, brought to you by Ramon. Also, I would like to say, if you're new to the podcast, this is the Win with Dice podcast all about tabletop RPGs, running them, playing them. Calvin and I like to, take a casual approach to GMing, and we just want to show you that, jump on the other side of the screen. It's not so bad.
Thanks for slipping in the proper intro. I've been a bit scatterbrained. We've been talking to a lot of people.
We're just really excited for all the Lancer content that we've been putting together and all the cool people we've been interviewing, like Miles here. So yes, okay. So enough of this flim flam. The Win with Dice weekly GM tip of the week. So you know how cool movies are.
Sure.
And how like. Where am I going with this, Calvin? I want to say that, there's lots of times in RPGs, especially ones with combat, especially ones with tactical combat, especially those Dungeons and Dragons games, where you just kind of find yourself in a fight. Maybe you're poking around a dungeon, maybe you're just kind of walking around the overland, and you just run into a fight, and you just reduce some hit points, and then that's it, right? Mm-hmm. I find those to be kind of boring, or at least not so engaging to players, right? I know players just want to roll some dice and have some fun, but I think a lot of times you need to interject that kind of narrative, that kind of stakes to it. So I think if you want to introduce a fight, maybe think about why you're putting it in, right? What's the point of it? What's the point of the scene? What are the stakes of the scene? Like, that question of like, well, can the players do X before Y, right? So even if it's a random encounter, you need to have like a little bit of flavor in it. Like if it's a bandit attack, well, maybe the players have to stop the bands before they steal whatever from them or from whatever NPC that's there. Or like you're going through a dungeon, it's like, well, the players have to defeat X bad guy in the dungeon before they warn everybody else in the dungeon, or maybe destroy something that they were trying to recover or something like that. But just having a bunch of dudes kind of stand in a room and then you just open the door and then you beat each other up, I think it's we could do a little better than that. So yeah, that's the weekly GM tip of the week.
Introducing some sort of like timed component or some sort of stakes, really, that sort of amplify why you actually want to do this combat. Like you as the players would actually want to be involved in this sort of thing. Even a random combat. As a GM, this again depends on what game you're playing, what setting you're in. If it's a situation where random combats may arise, then it has to feel like thematically appropriate to whatever area the players are in, right? Like it has to feel like part of the story that you're already constructing all together.
Yeah, or at least add something like setting details or like maybe some interesting facts about the area. I mean, having enemies run away, it can also be more detrimental than, losing some hit points. Because, I mean, they know you're here. They can plan ahead. Maybe they can set an ambush. Like, maybe not letting them run away is actually the goal of the party in that fight. So, there you go. Weekly GM tip of the week. Just make your combats a little bit more, narratively involved.
Yeah, I think that is useful information to all the GMs out there. But speaking of GMs, let's get into something that is, I think, very useful for GMs, a setting that you can put your game in. So let's just start off with Miles. Let's give you an actual proper introduction if you want to just tell people, who you are, maybe your history with RPGs and Lancer.
Sure, yeah. So, I'm Miles, as we said. I've been, I think, following the Lancer community for coming on like 3.5 years now, something like that. Pretty much, I think, since like the 1.7 release for it, which is forever ago now. And I think prior to that, a lot of my RPG experience, I guess, really I could say, and this is, the classic, the first time I ever played an RPG, it was Dungeons and Dragons when I was in middle school, and my friend's dad had all the like 4E source books, and we played, I think, one game, nice. And none of my other friends liked it, and we never played it again. But that was like the hook for me. I was like, oh, this is amazing. This is great. Because I was that kid growing up who, which I think is obviously true of a lot of people. It's like, I love to read. I read a lot of like fantasy. I read like, this is the stupidest thing to say. My dad read The Lord of the Rings to me and my brother as like a bedtime story. And I think that left a lasting psychological impact.
Yeah, I can imagine it would.
And so finding, so I played D&D was the big thing I was into for a long time. And then finding Lancer was really exciting because I ran into it. I think the exact through line, I actually know it exactly, is I started listening to Friends at the Table, which is a very good actual play podcast, and followed the GM on that, Austin Walker, on Twitter, who retweeted a single piece of art from that early release of Lancer. And I was like, oh, this looks cool. Here's a mech. That's interesting. I'll check out this project. And then like 3 years later, I've been hanging around for 3 years and written like, I don't know, the field guide to Castor and Pollux is itself sitting around like 115 pages currently, with the edits that I haven't put in yet. And on top of that, done probably at least another 100 pages of other miscellaneous homebrew work and like setting writing. It's really become a creative outlet in a lot of ways for me, which I think is both in large part because the mechanical game design of Lancer I think is very soundly made. I've tried my hand at 5e homebrew before, and I think it's a much harder thing to get into. Lancer has a much lower barrier to entry. And then also because I think the setting writing for Lancer is just really rife for digging into and really evocative and gives you a lot of room to work with as like a third-party writer. So it hooked me.
Yeah, I mean, like, it not only has, like, that large physical space, but there's also a large space for so many different concepts and ideas that you can fit that will still, like, fit within the canon of the game, but allow you to explore all sorts of different, like, genres and different characters and ideas and things like that.
Yeah.
I was kind of interested, though. You did mention 4E. I was just sort of curious about your opinions on 4E, because so far every person we've had on has been a fan of it. I think like everyone who's mentioned it has been a fan of it, and I'm coming to realize I think maybe the people who don't like it are only people who maybe only played it once or just never played it at all and just say it as a meme.
It's funny because I know a lot of the people who have been on this podcast, and so I know their opinions on it. And I think I can only say so much because, like I said, I've only actually played it that one time in middle school, so forever ago now. And I don't think I was, who knows how good of a view into it that was. But I have played a lot of 5e, and what little I can compare between the two with my little experience with 4e is that I do really respect a lot of the mechanical choices it makes compared to 5e. And especially now, knowing what little about it I do, and also knowing the Lancer system very well because a lot of 4e DNA made it into Lancer, I think the thing I like about it the most is just it knows exactly what it wants. It is very clean mechanical pacing. It has a lot of issues, I do think. Like, there's a reason that people argue about it, and maybe some of them are right. Some of those complaints are valid, some of them not so much. I think people do put it down a little unnecessarily because it's in vogue to do that, like you said. But it is a very it has some very well thought out pieces that come together very, very nicely. And I do think more people even if people don't want to play it, I think more people should look at it in terms of like game design. People should appreciate and think about why they did things the way they did, and why when they changed going to 5e, which is a game I do enjoy, but I also have my own complaints about it, why some of those things change and maybe things that shouldn't have, and why it makes 5e actually a lot more tricky sometimes to pick up. I think it's a little unfairly maligned.
That's fair. I mean, I think the language in 4th edition Dungeons & Dragons is cleaner. Like, it's a lot easier to know exactly what is going on because they clearly lay it out. But sometimes in 5e with, you know, all the different types of actions and, you know, all the different interactions in that kind of scenario, I think it's weird because I think that their action economy is all weird, but their actual mechanics of rolling dice is pretty good. Right?
Yeah.
Yeah, you know, just simplifying everything into accuracy and difficulty or whatever they call it in Dungeons & Dragons. I can't remember.
Advantage.
Yeah, advantage. Right. It's like it's. I think that's the best thing that's ever happened to Dungeons & Dragons since, I don't know, it was invented, probably, which is so weird. But I had the same experience with 4th edition as you, because I played one game of 4th and bounced off of it because I think mostly on the GM's fault. It's not their fault. It was like our first time playing it, and I didn't really get it. But then we switched to 3.5, played that for a very long time because I had a friend who was a pretty good DM, and we did that for a very long time. And then we switched to Pathfinder because that was the most third 3.5 edition like, so we're just kind of more used to going into that system, and then, you know, switching to Lancer afterwards and looking at 4th edition and being like, I wish I played that game. I was like, man, I wish we stuck with it a little bit longer because I think there was some good stuff there.
Yeah, I think it kind of died a little bit before its time. It was like so almost there, and then just didn't attain the critical mass following it needed to keep going the way that now 5e kind of has, as this like cultural powerhouse. And now it is just kind of hard to go back to, because it's like, well, now all the people who did play 4e have kind of gone on to like take those ideas and make them a little bit like neater and more modern, and actually going back and engaging with it is a little like, this is maybe more trouble than it's worth.
Yeah, you can see all like the clunkiness a little bit, and see all the dust in the stuff, and you're just like, yeah, it's fine. We'll just make something new. We'll pay homage to it, right? In the things that we're going to create, but you know, we're not going to go back and play that system, and that's perfectly fine, I think. But enough about 4th edition. That's not even anything to do with Lancer.
A little bit.
Yeah.
Well, it's the great grandpa.
Yeah.
In that case, then, let's get into Castor and Pollux, these two planets, the system that they're in. I'm actually I was kind of curious about like the inspiration for it, because I feel like it's sort of inspired by like the mythical Castor and Pollux in a way, but I'm also just like, well, I mean, very clearly inspired by that, but I'm also just curious about other inspirations for it. So I guess, how would you describe this setting to a new GM coming into it?
Sure. I think my elevator pitch would be that, let's see. Oh, I think I have one written out somewhere, but God knows where that is. But I think it would be, assuming you're familiar with the Lancer system, or even if you aren't, here are two fresh colonies from this golden age of expansion, where after that, that were seeded right as that golden age faded, and were just kind of left abandoned and adrift, and developed on their own, and were doing fine in the same system. And as they developed, kind of held on to those ideas of like the gross manifest destiny that seeded them, and instead of being these compatriots, these allies, these twin colonies, turn against each other and spark an entire civil war, fighting over petty resources and material gain. And before that war can finally go hot, one of the planets is completely wiped out in a freak stellar event, just a natural disaster. And so this war that never happened kind of bubbles away into nothing. And then we cut to 100 years later. The surviving planet is rich, it's happy, it's wealthy. It still has these very materialistic ideals. So I say it's rich and happy and wealthy. It's happy in the way that a place I can describe as rich and wealthy is, where some people are rich and happy and some people aren't.
Right.
And now 100 years later, they've had these 100 years of peace, kind of profiting off of the death of their sister, brother, twin, whatever. And now, suddenly, as they're beginning to reach back out into the world, they're kind of touching out to the people that originally founded them. It turns out this other colony isn't as dead as they thought. And now this war that never quite popped off before is finally starting to spark up again, and will suddenly accelerate from 100 years of tension and hostility into a system-wide conflict that will, without any intervention, probably end with both planets leveled, essentially. Or if one survives, it will be at the cost of the existence of the other. And so that's where the players come in, and the GM. You're kind of thrown into the system right as this conflict is starting to rise up again. And as people there, it's kind of up to you as the players to interfere, see what you can do to avert this coming disaster, see if you can find a third option, see if you can finally put to rest all of these scars and wounds from the past 100 years.
Yeah.
I think that's the quick pitch. Not that quick, but...
Oh, I think it's great, though. Like, I really like how involved the players can be in just sort of changing the direction of fate for these two different colonies, like this entire system, really. And, like, it can be, like, smaller scale things, it can be a larger scale thing, but I like when players are able to have impact on the overall world, the overall direction that the story can take, like having that massive impact on the entire setting. Is that something that you were, like, aiming to have on purpose, or was it just sort of... Well, like, I'm kind of guessing that it was, but I was wondering, like, how much impact you wanted players to have on the setting as they played through it.
Yeah, I think it actually was kind of one of the places I started with when I was first thinking about it. It's something I appreciate about Lancer, again, like, in the setting of it, is I think it knows the scale that it wants, kind of, because it has this assumption that, like, okay, you are, at the most, like a big table, you're like 6 individual mech pilot soldiers. And so, you're not leading entire armies. And so when you think about a lot of, like, mech, like, fiction, whether it's, like, your sort of, like, super robot, like, I don't know, Big O, stuff like that, that's on, like, just, like, on Earth, or even, I don't know, Evangelion, kind of. But thinking more about, like, the big sci-fi, like, Gundam stuff, the main characters are important, but they're all only ever fighting in one front of a war. They change the course of it, but they're not the ones leading every single battle. They're not shaping every single conflict on every planet. So you kind of have to pick your focus, and that's where they make a difference. And it's a big difference, but they can't shape the entire thing. And so when I was thinking about Castor and Pollux, the thing I really wanted, I wanted to focus on a single system, because I thought that anything more than that, the scope gets a lot bigger, a lot faster. Travel times, and this is, up to individual tables. If we go by the Lancer canon, travel time from one system to another could take, like, potentially years. And so that gets weird for maintaining a consistent narrative. But I figured one system, the scope is small, and this is something I think I'm maybe even need to make more explicit when writing it. But I don't know, I've never seen much issue with it, is that there's no way to stop this war from starting again. When the players show up, even if it hasn't started yet, it's going to spark into open conflict. And there's no way to avoid that. Because no matter what happens, the players are small enough that they can't stop the inertia of these two planets with millions of people on them. But once it does start, they can have the influence to like intervene in individual events. They can't, again, like they can't be in every fight, but in the ones they are, they can pick, you know, here are the people I'm going to try and save. Here are the things that I'm going to keep as like important messages in this war, where like I'm not going to let this be about total annihilation. I'm going to make this about a better future for everyone. And so when I say that, like, without player intervention, the idea is that these colonies will destroy each other. But because the players are there will still be this war. It still won't be good. War never is. But they might be able to tip the scales just enough that both sides come out alive. And in that, I think, is like the value in making those little pushes rather than trying to swing the entire thing one way or the other.
Okay, so it's less about evading the conflict entirely and more about how much can you save and how much like impact can you have from who you are able to save. Like how much of this fire can you put out with what water you have available to you, basically.
Yeah, I think that's a good way of saying it. Because I think it is a little... Some people, I think there's a place for stories where you have these really big, like, sweeping impacts that sort of, like, I mean, it's sci-fi, but, like, the mythic fantasy feel of, like, you know, here's my D&D character that started as, like, a kid with a stick from a village, and I'm going to go kill God now at level 20. Like, people like those stories. I like those stories. They're cool. But I think it's interesting to have something that's a little bit more grounded in the idea of like, here is a conflict that is just, it's there. You can only do so much, but do what you can anyway, even though you can't solve the whole problem. You still have to try.
Yeah. Which is why I think that Lancer gears itself to be that kind of game. Like it's so far like the theme of everything that we've heard from all of the homebrew community has been like Lancer is cool. You can do a lot of stuff into it, but the stories are really about the people and their struggles, right? And like trying to do something about the inevitable tragedies that are going to happen, but you can't just like stay on the sidelines, which is kind of nuts because I think I didn't really get the naming choice of No Room for a Wallflower until I started actually playing it, and then I'm like, oh, I get it now. It's like you can't actually just stand by and watch these things happen to these people. You have to show up and do the work and do the hard work, which is all what I'm about. I love Lancer so much. Yeah, it's cool.
Yeah, Ramon is he's the one who introduced us to Lancer, our little group, and also ran our streamed game a while back. I'm trying to think of the first instance I think it was literally just searching on Kickstarter, and Kickstarter was like, hey, have you heard about Lancer? And I was like, no. What is this? And then I saw like the artwork on the cover page, and I was like, wow.
Oh yeah. I think so many people have gotten pulled in by the art. I know I did originally. It's like, it's one of those things where it's like, God, I wish I was like a critically acclaimed comic book artist, because it makes it a very good pitch for your game even before it's done.
Yeah. It's just like, look how this cool. You could be this person. You could be this cool, right? And yeah, God bless all the cool artists out there making, us wordy boys. People look at our stuff, so
yeah, it really is like a great selling point. Like people can just something to see, so they immediately get a sense of like, oh, that's what this thing looks like. This is the tone it's trying to evoke, and also it looks neat. Now I want to know more.
Yeah.
So with regards to Castor and Pollux, like this setting, like what was your? Well, I mean, I guess you've mentioned sort of, I guess, like what the story inspiration was like for the players. I'm kind of wondering what the inspiration is for the lore or the setting itself.
Yeah. So I think I came at it from a couple different angles, and because it took a while. It took a little while to develop, because I think the original part of the push for it was I basically just sat down and decided I want to do a full like setting piece, because before that, I'd kind of just done a lot of like the mechanical player side homebrew of like, here's like a new mech you can use, which was fun and I enjoyed doing it. But I wanted to make a more thought out actual like long form piece, that a setting that players and a GM could use and be interested in. And so then I had the thought, and then I was like, well, okay, what would it be? Like, what do I actually want from that? And so I did come at it from a couple of different places. I think the first part was I decided what of my mechanical homebrew that I already come up with I wanted to put in it. And so I picked the one I went with, which is Pinnacle Industries, which is this like colony building corporation that's has this focus on like terraforming and early colonies. It's very like blue collar style. And so I was looking at that and thinking like, okay, so if this is the present force, then the setting I want is a place they would be present, which is like this newer colony, somewhere that's still developing, somewhere that isn't this like big developed world, which then also works because in Lancer, usually a lot of these bigger developed worlds also tend to not experience this like small scale issues that I wanted in the same way. I would more easily imagine for them if it was like, here's this, super developed hypertech planet that's been around for 2,000 years. Well, they're not going to have this little mini civil war. Or if they do, it's going to be so big that it's going to like spiral away from the players, even beyond what they can, there won't be any fires to put out because the players are going to get burned up in them. And so now then I'm at the point where like, I want these two little colonies, or I want a colony. And then I was realizing like, oh, I'm kind of brushing up against, like you said, No Room for a Wallflower, which is also like, here's this fresh colony. So what am I doing to make it feel different, to make it a unique story? And importantly as well, how do I make it human? Which is, I think, the other important part. I think it's easy for Lancer, or for a lot of sci-fi in general, to make the sort of antagonistic forces in it be, here's this evil AI, here's this alien species, here's whatever, here's like this outside context problem that you throw players at and be like, fight this guy. And I think I really wanted it to be a story about people, not people doing bad things to other people, but about people making mistakes, and just a very human conflict that wasn't like evil empire that's kind of evil for evil's sake. It's just people who are upset and making choices that sort of spiral into disaster. And so from there I went, well, I want it to be a human against human conflict. I have one colony. Why not just make it two? And I think in my very first draft of it, the idea I had was that they were like two cities on the same planet. And then eventually they shifted into being two planets because it just felt like it made more sense. It made it more of a fun parallel, that they were these twins. And that's then also how I got to the name for Castor and Pollux, was like, here are these little like mirror parallels of each other developing alongside each other that should be this like perfect match and like, have this siblingly relationship, but just don't turn out that way. And then you break the parallel with this one planet experiencing this big disaster. There's this solar flare that just scours the whole thing. And then we have instead this sort of like dark parallel where we have one world that's this perfect garden, beautiful metropolis, and this other world that's like a scorched, barren wasteland. And trying kind of playing that contrast off of each other. And from there, it kind of wrote itself in a lot of ways. Once I had that basic idea of just, here are two places, they grew up alongside each other, they've decided they don't like each other, and one of them experienced this disaster. I had all of that foundation, then I basically just sat down and wrote it. And I had my little moments of like, okay, well, why don't they like each other? And the answer is because they are fighting over the system. Each of them wants to be the only one left. And it's like, well, why are they doing that? And it's because, well, they're fighting over like resources and material wealth. They want to be like the richest one. They want to have that power. And like, why are they doing that? Because in this setting, In like Lancer's setting, it's a little, it's very like post-scarcity, like there's not as much of that like hard like capitalist bent to it. And it's like, well, the reason they're like that is because they were founded by sort of the last generation, or the last like political generation, which was a lot more like that. That was much more manifest destiny, like I said, like material focused. And so here's a place that is holding onto those ideas way longer than everyone else because they were isolated. There are these two sort of abandoned colonies that basically never got the memo, like, hey, we should be better to each other. And are instead taking those ideas to the logical conclusion where they're like, well, I'm the only one that can exist. You have to die. And then a lot of the rest of it was, like I said, I sat down and wrote. I had all those ideas, and then just as I wrote, the ideas came of like, here's like the individual events. Here's like the first escalation of the war. Here's what it looks like afterwards. Here are the people that live here and the institutions that live here. I think one of the first pieces I wrote of like, the field guide has a lot of little bits of like factions and places and people that just kind of exist as little puzzle pieces that a GM could use to just put into the story. And one of the first ones I wrote was, it's a place called the Grapevine, which is in this system. There's these two planets. There's also a smaller planet that's kind of like, it's Mercury is really what it is. It's small, hot, close to the sun, very metallic, very mineral rich. And so it's the main place these planets are fighting over. And then there's also a gas giant that they're, mining for whatever sci-fi people mine gas giants for. And one of the first things I wrote was the Grapevine, which is this system of satellite space stations that orbit the gas giant and mine off of it. And I was like, here's this world that still exists that is this like very material focused, money-centric, like mercantile world. And now I want to make a contrast for it because I don't want that to be the only story here. So now the Grapevine is this like separatist worker collective that basically rebelled against these ideas and said like, no, we should be better to this. Like they kind of organically had the revolution that the rest of the universe did. And I just kept going like that. Like, here's my setting. And then this is how the setting responds to itself kind of for over and over again of like, here's little bits that spin and spiral off of that just once they're written and once I had them down, it's like, oh, of course this is here. Like this makes perfect sense for this to be here. I don't know how this system would exist without it.
Okay, so like you plant the seed for something and then it just sort of practically like develops on its own, like that circular relationship of like you add different pieces to it. And as you're going, you see like, well, this would probably be like the next logical step, or this is something that could and maybe would happen here. Yeah,
I think it's like, I'm not going to toot my own horn and say like, and it's like, it was that easy and this is what any good setting should be like. Because I mean, I don't know, maybe I'll talk about this more later, but I actually have a lot of things that I kind of wish I'd done differently when I was first writing it. And I've now kind of not written myself into a corner, but I'm like, oh, how could this have been different? Because at this point, I'm not going to change it because it would require rewriting the whole thing, and I don't want to do that. I'm happy with where it is.
I mean, we could.
But it is, yeah. It was.
Oh, sorry.
Oh no, sorry. Go ahead.
Oh no, I was just gonna say we could get into that if you wanted to. I think that's something that other home brewers and developers might be interested in. Like even people who are just making their own smaller campaign settings for other games or whatever might be kind of curious about that process, and maybe like I'm sure other people have come across that same problem before, so I'm kind of curious how you feel about it.
I guess I'm like, I do have some opinions on it, mostly coming from my own work, which is that there are things I wish I kind of changed about Castor and Pollux or had in from the beginning, and now it just takes that effort to rewrite it, which is on like a broad scale.
I mean, you don't have to get into like specifics, especially if that is something that you think you might revisit later. I'm just kind of curious, like how you go about, like, do you at this point try to think, how can you make this work now on a smaller scale maybe, or is it just something that's too big that it would like upend everything you have?
Yeah, I think in terms of process, I think small things are actually pretty easy to work in, as it turns out. Like it's easy if there's this kind of great inertia about. It's the issue of editing your own work. It's hard because it's hard to look at your own work and figure out the flaws in it because you've stared at it and you have it in your head. Like you have like the perfect vision of it. but even if your words don't always convey that, so you really need someone else to look at it to tell you like what's missing. Small things are easy to add. Like as I've gone through and done revisions on the field guide, I've gone back and like changed a sentence here or there to kind of like better present the image that I want. In terms of big things that would change the whole setting, what I've decided with myself is that I'm not going to bother doing them because I think it's kind of the like perfect is the enemy of the good. I could rewrite the field guide to Castor and Pollux 10 times over, if not more. I could do it forever. And every time it would be, slightly different, a slightly different story. And it would be more what I wanted in that moment. But then give it another 6 months and I would say, oh, but what if I did this? And
yeah. I see,
I think each of the ideas is like, they are each good for themselves. Because there is no perfect field guide. There's no perfect setting guide. There is no perfect Castor and Pollux. There's just a bunch of different versions that are all good. And at some point I have to pick one and make that the one that actually gets written. And so I have to be happy with it.
So would you use those ideas that in future work, I'm assuming? Like you probably, if you would want to write another field guide or some other material?
Yeah, I think definitely. I think it's, and this is something that I think is good for really any creative project, is like, if you have an idea, just write it down somewhere. Like at some point it will come back and be useful and helpful. And even if you don't use it directly, just the exercise of sitting and thinking about it is good because it makes you think about it. It lets you exercise that creative muscle. It's like, for an artist, do a lot of sketches, draw when you feel like drawing, because all of that practice, even if it's a little doodle in the margin of whatever notebook, is still you exercising that creative effort and figuring out what exactly you're doing. And then now 3 years later, when you're, painting your big canvas, you'll be like, oh, this is kind of like that doodle I drew in the margin of that notebook. Right. And I'm really glad I did that instead of not. And so I think when it comes to writing stuff, I kind of have the same opinion. I write down just a lot of ideas. I have a lot of abandoned Google Docs with, bullet point lists of concepts and themes, not even really like setting details or characters or anything, just vague aesthetics. And who knows if I'll ever come back to them. But everything that I've done before the field guide to Castor and Pollux is what let me write this.
Right. Yeah, so having those in place helps you for your future things. It also, I think that's also good advice for people who suddenly come up with ideas at like 3 a.m. and you need to get them down so you don't forget them. I think it's good advice just to write those down as well.
It totally is. I know you mentioned that you liked the ship rules from Castor and Pollux, which I can tell you, as stupid as it sounds, came to me in a dream. I woke up in the middle of the night and was like, because I was thinking, I had already written a lot of the setting details, and I was like, I want something more mechanical meat on the the narrative side. I put all these mechs in here, but I want players to have stuff that isn't just mechs and another way to interact with the world. But what should that be? And I'm thinking about Lancer's model of downtime actions of here's what you do in between missions. And I kind of hadn't settled on anything that interesting. I had a vague idea about you could go digging through the ruins on Castor, which is this ruined, flare scorched world. But nothing that was really striking me. And then woke up in the middle of the night and was like, oh my god, I should give them a ship. And wrote that down, and then came back to it a week later and was like, oh, this was a good idea.
That is brilliant.
Yeah, nice. That's how it's a good thing, where you wake up, you're like, oh, I have to write this down.
Your entire body needs it to be real.
It really was. It was so funny. That's not. I can't remember any other specific ones, but that's not the first idea I've had like that to any, I don't know, aspiring creative people out in the world. Just whenever you're stuck on something, just fall asleep, and it will solve itself for you. And I think that works 90% of the time.
That's fair. That's fair. My wife doesn't like it when I do this thing where I'll be like doing something, like I'll be cleaning or something like that, and I'll figure out the problem because my brain was chugging the entire time, and I'll just audibly be like, aha. And look her dead in the eye, and she's like, what are you doing? And be like, I was thinking about this problem for like weeks and I just figured it out. And then she just like, palms her face and she's like, what an idiot. What
It's funny how it works, because it really is like, sometimes you don't even know that you're thinking about it, and then all of a sudden it's like your brain taps you on the shoulder and it's just like, oh, by the way, here's this. You asked for this a while ago.
Yeah, human beings are kind of crazy like that. But
yeah, it took some time to process.
I know that I'm a big fan of the ship rules that's in the field guide. I think it was brilliant. I was like, honestly, like I do like the idea of giving the players like a base or a place where they can talk to all their NPCs. That's like a big thing of me in like my fantasy setting games. So the idea of like they could just have a ship and then I could just put all the cool people they like on the ship, and then it's easy. I don't have to worry about them. You'd be like, oh, we're so and so. Well, they're just on the ship, right? And I do like the idea of just like the players can work on it, right? They can make the ship better. They can upgrade it, or they can just put whatever they want on it. It just becomes another way for the players to interact with the world, and it solves a lot of logistic problems.
Yeah.
Yeah, it really does. And I think it kind of opens up the idea where, now you can, instead of, if you wanted to have like a greater, I guess, more galaxy spanning adventure, right? Touching base in all the regions of Union space or beyond, then you could just, giving them a ship kind of gives the idea of like, you could have like a monster of the week kind of thing, where the players just, their ship shows up in a system and they muck around in there for a little bit and then they just leave and go do something else next time. It's like Star Trek, right? It's all about the people on the ship, and they keep meeting other people, and you can just sit there and talk to them, and then as soon as you're done with that plot line, you're just like, all right, time to bounce, and kind of do that. So
yeah, I mean, like I was kind of wondering like how this thing, like how you went from the sudden inspiration idea and how you developed it, and if you did like any play testing and things like that. Because for our game, like I had a really good experience with it. Like I know one player, he has like a whole company of like pilots and stuff, like that whole security company that work on the ship. For me personally, my character was very much like that grungy mechanic type, so just having a ship to tinker with, and it was a total hunk of junk with a lot of personality, obviously. But that's like my favorite kind of spaceship. So yeah, I just really enjoyed that. So I'm kind of wondering like how you went from that first idea that you wrote down to actually developing it. Like if you do like play testing and things like that, or what kind of feedback you got on it.
Yeah, I think I will say definitely, and this is I think another just like, I don't know, I'm not like a professional creative, so I can't say, here's a tip for people doing work, because I don't know if I'm the best person to ask. But steal from people. You steal a lot. It's whatever, I don't know, T.S. Eliot, like good poets steal or whatever it is. Because when I came up with this ship idea, I was thinking like, okay, but what does that actually look like? And, what does, because it's like, to your point, it's like here's like a base, but what does a base look like? What does that look like in terms of like a tabletop setting? And I realized I did have a good example, which is just from my own personal experience, was Blades in the Dark, which is just another tabletop game that has a nice downtime mechanic of having a base and upgrading your base and having players invest in it kind of in between missions. And so that kind of, knowing how they wrote it kind of informed the structure that I wanted of like, oh, here's your home base. It starts out small and you can add onto it over time. And so that's where I kind of had the idea of like, you start off with a ship. It has super basic functions. If you want to add anything specialized to it, you have to put in the effort. And also, because I was thinking about Blades in the Dark, it also made me think about, well, Blades in the Dark is a game that has a lot of consequences for players. There's a lot of ways to kind of fuck up, or not fuck up, it's you playing the game, where it makes the world mad at you and bad things happen to your players. Blades in the Dark is not a fun game for the player characters. They suffer a lot. But that kind of thinking, like, oh, this shouldn't all be... It's like, this shouldn't make the players sad, but I should present them with complications and problems, is then why all the ships come with complications, I think is the name of that table.
Yeah.
Of like, here's something, here's your ship. It's great. It's perfect. It can fly wherever you need it to. By the way, here's a big glaring issue that is going to keep biting at you whenever you fail a roll, and is... Like, here's the ship that I'm handing to the players for them to have fun with, and here is something wrong with the ship that I am handing to the GM for them to have fun with. And then, admittedly, from there, and I'll say, actually, I think the ship rules are another place where it's like, oh, what if I did this differently? Because I think from there, it was they're not super long, complicated rules. From there was a lot of like filling out, okay, what is everything people would want on a ship? Here's all the modules. Here's all the different possible complications. Here's all the little neutral quirks. Here's the basic structure of how players interact with it. And then I was kind of done. And it's like, I could have gone more intensive into it, but I didn't want that to be the main focus of the guide. And it's one of those things where it's like, oh, I wonder, like, should I have added more? But I'm happy with where it is.
Right. I would say that I think it's the perfect amount, because it gives the idea of what you're trying to come across, but it's not telling you exactly. So as a GM, it was very easy for me to kind of like just read it and be like, oh, okay, cool. I know what to do, how to add it into my story, because I do appreciate that it's like, you know, the idea of like a no-fly list, right? That's a thing that players have to deal with, right? Or like, my favorite one is it's just haunted. Like, your ship is just haunted. So you could just have cool, silly, weird moments where like there's just like a random ghost lady just stalking your halls or something, and you're like, I don't know, you can't explain it, it's haunted, don't worry about it. And then, you know, you could have everyone kind of, you know, like narratively relate to it, like in your story, being like, oh yeah, this is the, like, you know, you could be in a scene and it's like a hunk of junk, so you'll have something just fall out, and everybody would be like, yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, I appreciate it so narratively focused. I guess because it's like a downtime activity, so like inherently it would be. But I appreciate that it's less of a mechanical thing. It's less of a, your ship is X speed slower and turns Y faster. Even though I could sometimes like that sort of thing in a certain game, but like I like it here because it's just more like the ship isn't like another character so much as it is a space to explore, and it will have these complications and situations. It's sort of like the same as exploring any other part of a setting.
Yeah, and like, oh man, just like number 15 of the quirks, the aggressive, the very aggressive cleaning drone has like, you know, just the idea of it has sparked so much of attitude this ship could have. Or like this little robot, just every time you walk or smudge something, it gets really mad and goes and cleans it. Or like it'll try and like go and dispose of something that you're like working on because it's like kind of greasy or something like that. Like just the right amount of you know, to spark their imagination to use for a GM to use.
Yeah, I think you mentioned like the idea of like Star Trek, like your ship going around and encountering all these things. I think when I was writing a lot of those lists and ideas, and I think this is something I do in a lot of my writing, is I was thinking about like, well, what do I love most from TV shows and books and, you know, comics and other people's writing and whatever. And so a lot of those ideas were like, oh, I could totally see this being the especially for the quirks, because they're kind of supposed to be like neutral, kind of funny, kind of present, but not really things in the background are like, this could be like a funny recurring bit in some sci-fi TV show, or this could be happening in the background of a Star Trek episode, or like the thing they're dealing with for one episode, or this is the thing that, you know, Han Solo is complaining about being wrong with the Millennium Falcon or something.
Right.
And it's like, this is what I want to have in my world because it's the thing that I like seeing in other stories. I do think the cleaning droid might be one of my favorite ones on the quirk table, actually.
I'm trying to remember which one we had on our ship. I can't recall. It may have been the distillery. Was it the distillery in the...
Yeah, I think we tied that to one of the other characters as well.
Yeah, and I also I think there was also like over the intercoms there was like a hum or whatever, but I'm pretty sure every time we were like everybody was talking on the ship, I just did like the Halo sound, like the dun 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 dun, like while we're like trying to have like a serious talk, just to remind everybody that like this random noise keeps coming up on the ship. It's just, I don't know, I really think it's so fun just to kind of you know, have the quirks, because you know the game I like to run is like, you know, it's serious when it needs to be, but it's also mad goofy.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, I appreciate this a lot.
Really fits
it's
in
like,
with that.
Thinking about, because I think one of my big inspirations for in my head how I think a lot of like Lancer ship stuff looks, and this is now I think sort of canon because now there's art for a lot of ships with their other game they're putting out. But it's like this very like, it's like Alien, like the Nostromo, this very like lived in sci-fi that's like a little bit clunky and messy. And it's totally that thing where like Alien is a scary movie about an alien, you know, it's a horror movie. But also there's that little duck that like swings back and forth and drinks, you know, the little like swinging duck that drinks the water out of the glass. Mm-hmm. That's just there in the ship. And it's really funny that it's there in this movie about a bunch of people getting brutally murdered. And so having those little funny things in the background in this otherwise very like lived in space in a greater, like the story is serious, but here's this little duck and that's great. Yeah. And it's so nice that it's there.
Yeah. And I love the fact that like, you know, the ships are probably older than the people, right? Like the ship isn't new. It's been flying for probably hundreds of years at this point, right? So there's like, and has tons of different owners and stuff like that. It probably has been abandoned at one point. So like, you know, and like retrofitted or whatever. So it's like, you know, you don't actually like the idea of like a starship. It's actually just like an apartment building that has jets on it, right? So you don't actually know what's in there.
Yeah, sometimes like you bust out a wall and there was a whole bathroom there that someone just spackled up at some point. Who knew?
And you're like, wow, free new bathroom, right?
Convenient.
You know, it's convenient. I adore ships. I feel like anytime I'm going to run Lancer, probably give the players a ship, and I probably will use these rules because it's mad easy and mad fun. That's for sure.
Yeah, I haven't personally tried the new like Lancer ship game yet, but I am wondering like if I can adapt some of these into it, depending on like how, because I figure that's more of a mechanical thing.
Yeah.
So I was wondering if maybe these could work for some more narrative situations with regards to that.
Yeah. There's like 3 new layers to it now, because it's the funny thing where now I've been I'm about to be shown up, which, and I say that, I don't feel that way actually, but there's now coming out for Lancer as well, there's going to be these mobile operating base rules, which are actually also a lot more strongly based on the Blades in the Dark system, where there's a lot more mechanical heft to it, and actual bonuses, where my rules are very narrative focused. And I kind of had a thought at one point when they were first announced, like, oh, should I change my ship rules because they're going to be made obsolete? But the thing that I kind of realized I actually like about them a lot is that they are very lightweight, pretty like loose, easy to handle, just this simple narrative setup. And that's why I want to leave them in, because now you kind of have these layers where someone who wants that really crunchy, detailed, like number heavy experience can do these bigger rules that give you a bigger benefit. But if someone just wants to have a ship and have it be there and part of the story, but not spend, you know, an hour planning out the exact bonus they want on it, then they can use my rules. And if they want to do a game entirely on ships, they can play Battle Group, which, from my understanding, I actually have also not played it, but from hearing people talk about it, it does something interesting. We were talking about scale earlier, where Lancer as a game is focused sort of on the small individual scale, whereas Battle Group is very intentionally on this much larger scale where it's like the smallest unit you have available to you as a player is a ship with thousands of people on it. And so suddenly you are shaping the whole scope of a conflict. So now you have this whole sort of like tiered layer of just how intensive do you want to get on this.
Yeah, and I think it's all useful, right? Because at some moments you're going to be wanting to just do something quick and dirty, and other times you want to do something crunchy. So yeah, I'm excited for all these cool new rules, and to shape your game and just add whatever you need to. So I wanted to touch base on all of the mech stuff because you have quite a bit of stuff. It's like half of the book is all these wonderful, cool licenses that we haven't touched on yet, and I would like to get into that.
Yes.
Of course.
I am a big fan of the peppercorn. It had this very, especially when I was looking at like all the things you can add to it, like that flaming wheel and like leaving traps behind. It had a very like Twisted Metal Mario Kart feel to me.
I was saying earlier about how like, write down every idea because it's going to come back and help you. The peppercorn is the first thing that existed of all of Castor and Pollux. So I'm glad people like it a lot because I've actually gotten a lot of positive statements about it, kind of to that effect, because it was first written as a joke, which was just basically me asking myself, like, what if I made like quote unquote a mech, but it was just a motorcycle, like, and then I did that, and then I was like, well, what would a motorcycle have as license, like as like the equipment on it? And then it was like, well, it's gonna play like a stupid Mario Kart, James Bond, like tricked out car. It has an oil slick on it because of, James. I don't know if that ever actually happens in a James Bond movie. It happens on, I don't know, Tom and Jerry, where like a car can just spray out like an oil slick behind it during a race.
Yeah.
And so I wrote that. I kind of had it as a... And I had it as a joke, and it sat as a solitary Google document for like a year. And then I named it the peppercorn on a whim because I had the idea of like, well, a peppercorn kind of looks like a wheel because it's round, and it's hot, like it's spicy. And this thing has some stuff that can set bits on fire. So there we go. It's a peppercorn.
Nice.
And then from there, I was like, well, it has to have a manufacturer name. And I'll make it a stupid joke as well, because this is just a joke and I'm never going to come back to it. And so it was Pinnacle Industries Non-Civilian Hardware hyphen Orion Faction, which shortens to Pinch of Peppercorn.
Oh. That's what.
And then I was like, oh. And so yeah, and you can see I did take that. So now in the final, from there it basically goes to, I came back to and was like, I made like another mech design, didn't have a place to put it. And I was like, what if I just put it here? And then I, a little while later had like 8 full mechs in there. And then when I made the field guide, had to shorten the acronym from Pinch of just to Pinnacle Industries Orion Faction. So it doesn't have the full pun in it anymore because it felt a little bit too jokey for the setting. It is still in the manufacturer text, the full name. So people who know it's there can kind of still pick out the acronym. Yeah, sorry, I got kind of off track there. But yeah, that's kind of where those all ended up. It started from this like kind of funny joke idea that I like couldn't let myself leave as a joke. I was like, well, I'm going to design this as a joke, but I'm going to make it work and make sense and be like a functional rule set. And then once I had that, I was like, well, I may as well finish the whole thing.
Yeah, well, I mean, it has a lot of character, I think, the Pinnacle Industries, because, I mean, even if you just say a pinch of, it's like that could be a term that maybe the company uses, or even the people who are using the mechs being like, just a reference to how good these things are, right?
Yeah.
But I do like how all of them are just, spices and seasonings. It's awesome that a killer giant robot is just called Basil.
Yeah, it's like, and it's funny because it started off again, it's like kind of just on a whim as a joke, and then it ended up informing a little bit of how I wanted to write them, where it ended up as being like, oh, you know, when you compare yourself to some of like the canon like Lancer frames, like looking at stuff like Harrison Army, where it's like we're gonna name ourselves after all these great generals. Like here's the Saladin, here's the Barbarossa, whatever. And then I was like, well, this company isn't presenting itself as this like big fancy schmancy like powerful thing, this like imperial force. It's very understated. They're not selling themselves off of their like that kind of like the machismo of it. But and then the other side of it is like, oh, so you're like, oh, like they're nice. They're kind of this like, there's a little bit the aesthetic in my head when I was writing them. It's like they're a little bit John Deere.
Yeah, that's
like
what I was thinking. I was gonna mention that like they just feel like tractors because a lot of them just
Yeah.
like move earth or whatever, or just is a chainsaw to cut logs or whatever, right? It feels like, you know, you can see a John Deere trailer and be like the Basil, right? Like, you know, we'll never let you down or whatever, right? Or like a car or something like that, like a truck. It feels like, you know, like that kind of workman's vehicle versus like this, you know, instead of someone trying to sell you a gun, they're trying to sell you a tractor. Yeah.
Which then, and that's exactly how I approach it. Like that's the image that they're selling as well. And you know, it is true in a respect in the setting. But then the other side of it is like, well, but they are making killer robots. So what does that mean? And like, what does that mean for them? And what it means is that like, here is this like blue collar, like, dependable company that like, it does good work. And I kind of go into this in a lot of like the little bits of like the like little like fluff, like lore bits in all of them. That like, they do good work. These like Pinnacle Industries as a company, its whole ethos is like, it is making homes for people. It is building the worlds that humanity lives in. And it really cares about that. But it's also this massive, you know, at this point, probably decades, if not centuries old company that at some point is a corporation more than it is any group of people. And so after a point, it becomes profitable to also make things that go into war. And so their kind of central conflict is that that dichotomy of we want to make the home that humanity lives in and provide for people, and kind of coming from some of the central ethos of union as well in the setting of like, humanity almost died once. We're never going to let that happen again. We're going to protect people wherever they are. Versus then this kind of like new angle of our sort of immediate profit and what we can get out of it. And so that's kind of like the story that the frames are telling a little bit is which way are they going to fall? Like which way is the scale going to tip for them? And that's why a lot of the licenses are a mix of either like, here's, you know, this old logging frame that, or like this old like earth mover frame that was, you know, a construction tool, a thing that people, you know, bought and rented out to build houses, and has now sort of been retrofitted into a military machine, versus the new stuff that's this much harsher, like, this was never built to be helpful. This was never built to be useful. This was only ever built to be a war machine. And there's meant to be a little bit of a, it's not super obvious, but it's, or I don't know if it is, but there's meant to be a little bit of a conflict there. It's why the last mech in the whole list is the Star Anise, which if you read through all the fluff on all the rest of them, it's kind of, it's, you know, it's like the corporate lingo, like it's them selling the mech, like it does this, it does that, here's what we use it for. And then the Star Anise is the last mech that I wrote in there is, the story that it's meant to tell through all the little lore bits on it is someone begging the person using it to do the right thing, because it's the one license that isn't sold or given out through like this main proprietor. It's kind of like held onto by a little subgroup that doesn't want to be used for military purposes. And so its whole story is like, now that you've read through this like massive military catalog, do the right thing anyway. Don't let this be what we are. And kind of, it's the funny thing of like, I mean, it's the tweet of, I hate the glorification of war, and violence is bad, and blah, 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 blah. But I do love it when a robot swings up its arms and the secret compartment comes out with a second set of arms and a big axe. Because mechs are cool, and I don't want to make the players feel bad for playing these big military war machines. But I do want to lay out the little bit of like, this is what the setting looks like. It's the same for Castor and Pollux. It's a little bit meant to mimic that, where it's like, we can be better, we can build a home, we can stay together, we can be something more than this, or we can just fight each other into dust. And you have to, at some point, make the choice about which way you want to go.
Yeah. I've been rewatching a lot of Castlevania lately, the Netflix series, and Isaac's character is one. I think he had a line that was like, hammers can build, a home, but it also can smash a skull in, right? And I like the ideas of, Pinnacle Industries. At least some of the mechs are very clearly like, you can use this mech to do a lot of good and make a community, like actually build a home, or you can use it to demolish someone's life, right? So that's cool. It's awesome. That in a nutshell, I think just kind of shows that these mechs are like, a lot of times they're like I think that you play your character, like the pilot, and you also play your character as the mech as well, right? There's always like, that's the cool thing I like about Lancer, is that you can have one person in the cockpit and the other person and what the actual mech is doing and how it feels. Because I know Calvin's character in her stream right now, she's a very positive, outgoing, very nice person, right? But she's piloting a Blackbeard, which is all sorts of carnage. It's very, very different from her outside the mech. So I like the idea that even that you created that, where like, these machines of like, building and agriculture and stuff like that are, when it's not wartime, it's like, oh cool, I can use this. But when the conflict does come, it's like, well, thank God this thing has this Gatling gun on it. 'Cause I gotta go shoot some folks now. So yeah.
I think it ties in well to like the themes that are like very present in the setting. Whether you want to build something up, or if you want to, take part in this conflict and start tearing things down.
Yeah. And the dual purpose too feels like, very much like in the frontier, like colonial nonsense, where it's like, you're on your own. So the only if you only have like this one mech, it's gonna have a plow and a gun on it because it needs to do all of it at the same time, right?
Yeah. And it's like the central, or not, I don't know, the central, but it's like one of the, like the big points when you think about it, about like these purpose-made military ones, where it's like, to any person out in the world living a good life, this is useless. Like, this thing that only comes with the Gatling gun on it is pointless. It shouldn't exist in the first place. Because if you hand this to someone and say, go dig an aqueduct, like go build a house, go provide for your family, they can't do anything with it. And so it shouldn't exist as a tool in the first place. But it does, and you kind of have to wrestle with that idea. I don't know if you have to wrestle with it, but the idea is there.
Sure someone is.
Yeah, I think that creates interesting like ideas for players. Like, they can see their mechs as more than just, like, they can see ways to use them outside of just in combat situations. I would hope like it might spark some ideas of different things they can do in their downtime with those machines that they usually save for where they're doing the rolling of dice and in different turns and things like that. Like, what else can we use them for in narrative ways?
Yeah, and I think, again, that's also still, I mean, I'll come back I could keep coming back to it I also forever, I think, to the Star Anise, because it is the last one that I wrote for Pinnacle, and is, I think, the one I tried to put most of like my most heart into, because it's very deliberately like, you could take this off of the battlefield and go build a city, and that could be all you do for the rest of the game. And at that point, you're not playing Lancer anymore. You're kind of, you retire that character. And then something you could do during downtime of like, you can envision something better than shooting guns at someone. And I guess to that point, it's like, I don't want the setting to come across as like, and every time that you ever fight, you're doing the wrong thing and your player characters are bad, terrible people. Because I think that's it lacks a little bit of nuance, because it's like, well, if the players all decide that they just want to go off and build a farm somewhere, they can, but these two planets are going to tear each other apart, and someone does have to step in. And so it's like, it matters that someone picks up the gun and decides that today they're going to fight. But it also matters that when the fight's over, you have a place to put the gun down and do something else.
Right. Yeah, like I can really appreciate like the two sides of that. I think like both from the perspective of a GM and a player, I think it's important to have that sort of thing. Like how we were saying up top with the tip of the week, it gives more context at least to those conflicts if you also have something that you're fighting for, or if you can go back to. We could talk about the NPC Mechs for a bit. I was sort of wondering, because you did mention, I think you have some tactics in there as well with regards to the NPC Mechs.
Oh, yeah.
I was just kind of wondering how you developed that sort of thing.
Yeah, this was... The NPC Mechs, I think they didn't come out with the first draft of Castor and Pollux, but they were kind of one of the last editions, because I kind of had my moment writing it where I realized, like, oh, I should hand more to the GM. And so, like, it's like I just did, 50 pages of stuff for the players to play with, but the GM is, a player at the table too. They deserve to have some fun. I should hand something their way. And it was kind of my first foray into designing for Lancer NPCs. And I think, and I kind of said this already, Lancer is a very tight system for homebrewing for. It's very, I think, well designed because it's very transparent about how it does things. And so it's very easy to just see exactly what your restrictions are, what you should be modeling. And so in terms of like the raw mechanical design, it wasn't too hard to get started. And so then the ideas I was having for how to write the NPCs were loosely, I wanted to have NPCs that covered a broad range of abilities and tactics. I didn't want to hand like 5 versions of just this thing shoots a gun at you really hard and it's scary, because that already exists in Lancer with the NPCs that already exist. I don't need to give people just more ways to do a lot of damage to a player all at once, because, I mean, kind of to the GM tip, if a fight is just the damage race back and forth and there's no like puzzle solving or like complicated choices to it, then it's not as exciting. It should have more like dynamism to it. Mm-hmm. So I decided I wanted like a broad spread of tactics. And then from there, I kind of took 2 approaches to how I design stuff, which is one, I had just written all of these new mechs for the player characters, and I had some mechanics that I liked. And so I was like, well, what if the NPCs got some of these? That would make sense. And so that's where you got stuff like the Architect NPC, which is very, I think, a little bit obviously, it's very similar to the Anise, where it is this like earthbender terraforming mech that doesn't do damage really to players, but shapes the battlefield around them. And so it was something where here, now it won't be a damage race, but now it's sort of the puzzle solving of, well, if the map is changing around you, how are you as players going to adapt and solve kind of that problem? Or the Interceptor, which is very much went in a different angle, but it's kind of just the Pinnacle lemongrass as this like small annoying bug flying around and harassing people. Mm-hmm. And then from there, I think I also just picked, here's something that I think would be cool, which is how a lot of my ideas start off of like, here's an aesthetic that I like. Here's just a single sentence description that I enjoy. And that's where the vector came from, which is the idea in my head was just, what if I made Lancer into a bullet hell? Because that would be funny.
I think, honestly, the vector is my favorite. I just like the idea of just drawing a bunch of lines on the battlefield and be like, don't be here. And watch the players try very hard not to be there.
And that was my answer of being like, well, I don't want to give something that's just like a huge gun that I point at them, because that doesn't present like a choice. That's just, well, you're either going to take the damage or not, whatever. But then when it's like, well, here's a bunch of places where you might take damage, so don't walk here, then suddenly players have to work around it, and it's interesting, and there's like a problem-solving aspect to it, which is, I think, how I feel about a lot of combat in Lancer and in tabletops in general, is if it's just about the damage race back and forth, then there's kind of like this very simple, straightforward, mechanical answer as to how it works, and that's kind of lame. I don't know, it can be fun sometimes, but it gets old. But the more you're like, I really like Into the Breach as like a total like tangent. Great mech game. Nothing at all like Lancer. Great little indie mech game that's like playing chess. And that's the best part of it. It's not about the damage race. It's about the chess playing and like puzzle solving of each moment. And so that's what I wanted to create when I was writing NPCs of like, here is a problem that players can solve, and like Lancer doesn't do, like the classic D&D thing is like, here's a riddle you have to solve. Lancer doesn't really do riddles because they don't really come across as well in a sci-fi setting. And so what's the mech fighting equivalent of a riddle or like a logic problem to solve? Here's all your pieces, how do you put them together?
Yeah. I mean, that's also the draw of DMing for Lancer. It's you could really put together some cool scenarios for your players to try and take apart. Going back to just like even just the NPCs here, you can really have the feel of like if they had to fight all these dudes at once, like, oh man, the battlefield's gonna be a mess. Like they're just gonna have to like wade through so much area of effects and just stuff, and I want to do it to my players so bad.
I don't know if I like the sound of that.
Yes, Kevin, be worried.
We are coming up on our time limit, but I did want to quickly ask, I guess I'm just curious how feedback has impacted the way you've written and developed this, and if that has had any impact on like change over time as people have taken the setting and run their own games with it or gone through it as players. Like, what sort of feedback you've gotten from that, and if that's made you want to like do things differently, or what that may have made you change.
Oh, totally. I think there is no way that Castor and Pollux would exist at all without other people's feedback. Kind of like I was saying about like editing your own work. After a point, it's impossible. You need somebody else to look at it and tell you what it's missing or what isn't coming across. And so the whole time I've been writing it, I mean, there's the obvious bit of like, well, all the mechanical like mech bits need to be like play tested and looked at to make sure they're balanced and fit in with the core material. And so that's been super helpful, people play testing stuff and then telling me how it went and what I need to change. And I try to incorporate those as I update the document and say like, oh, here's my change log. I changed this number to this number so that it, is on par with everything else. Mm-hmm. And for the setting itself, what I try to do is I try to look at the pieces that people like the most of it. Like when someone reads through the document and then says to me, oh, this bit stood out to me. I'm like, awesome. Like, cause I like all of it and I have my favorite pieces of the setting. But when other people tell me what they like about it, that tells me like, oh, here's what I should focus on and like write more about, because this is what is coming off as interesting to other people. Like outside of my own head, I have all my little pet bits, but for, some of them are maybe I love them because I, again, have this perfect vision in my head, but someone else isn't getting all that reading the document. And so I should elaborate more. one person in the Lancer Discord, I kind of offhandedly, for the setting, wrote a, like, kind of like cyberpunk, like, hackery gang collective, the Rat Pack, that exists in this big, like, wealthy metropolis. Because I figured it made sense for it to be there, and it was an angle for GMs to have the, like, Horus influence from, like, the core material. And then someone in the Lancer Discord wrote a character that was kind of, like, using that background. And I was like, oh, like, I'm glad that someone did. It's not that I wasn't expecting someone to, but because someone wrote about it and, like, engaged with it, it made me think a lot more about what that faction was. And instead of just kind of being this, like, flat stand-in, I was like, oh, I should actually think about them and figure out, like, what are their motivations? What do they actually look like in the setting? What does it mean for this group to exist? And instead of just using them as, like, a placeholder, kind of, it meant that because someone engaged with the setting, I decided I should engage with it more and really flesh it out. Versus, I don't know, if nobody ever talked about them or liked them, then maybe one day, I don't think I would get rid of them, but, they would never see anything new and interesting from that faction, because I'd be like, well, maybe it's not worth investing in.
Like, better put the development time into something that people are interacting with.
Yeah.
Okay. All right, yeah, that was just something I was curious about. I think, yeah, like, again, we've had some really interesting insight on the development process, especially in regards to, like, player feedback and things like that. Yeah, I think it's interesting that, people will start getting into something and then you realize, oh, there's maybe more that I could include here. There's probably there's other stuff I want to ask about, but we are coming up to an hour and 20.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, never mind. We passed it, so...
Oh, boy. Okay.
But this was very interesting. I really like this setting. I really like the concept of it. I kind of wanted to get into, like, some of the characters and things like that. But we are at the edges of our time, so we might have to... Like everybody else, I kind of feel like we want to have you back on the show so we can get into a few more details.
Yeah, I had a great time. Yeah, there is a lot. I could probably talk about this forever, so... But I won't keep you guys any longer.
Yeah, so we will have the link in the description below for the itch.io page. You can go check out Field Guide, Castor and Pollux yourself. If you're a GM, you can maybe start using it as a setting in your game. There's definitely like a lot of really interesting mech stuff there that you can use. Also comes with the LCP file if you want to put that in CompCon. So you can start using that in CompCon, because I use that all the time for mech building and mech design. It just makes the process a hell of a lot easier. So yeah, definitely go check that out. I do want to give shout outs. We will have links below to everybody we've talked to so far. Just, go there, check out their stuff. Some stuff like the Liminal Guide Kickstarter you might be a bit out of time for. But you can definitely go check out the project anyway and see other things that they've got going on. There's like too many people to list at this point, so I have to figure out a new way to do our outro. So we normally shout out like several different people, but now there's like 10.
There's a lot.
Yeah, I do specifically want to say, though, I do specifically want to mention, other than our own gaming streams and things like that, the Untold Stories project, where I'm at every Monday playing Mutants and Masterminds. They recently wrapped up their main campaign after about a year of streaming that. So it was a very, very emotional finale. And they've got a new show coming at the end of the month, so definitely go check them out, give them some love over there. I was also on a couple of one episode, and by the time this goes up, the second episode will be almost up, where they are playing the Cthulhu Awakens game for Modern Age. So definitely go check that out, and the Kickstarter for that being run by Green Ronin. I'll try to add a link to that below as well, in case you're interested in that sort of thing. But I think that is going to have to be it for this episode.
Yeah.
Thank you guys for having me on.
Yeah, thanks a ton for coming on. And just wanted to say thanks again to all our guests who have been on here for Lancer Month Part 2, which has been really fun to talk to all these incredible people. I'm very excited to do my own kind of Lancer stuff in the future. Hopefully I do something that's like half as interesting as all the stuff we were able to talk about this month or this 6 weeks.
6 weeks. Yes, it's been more than a month. We've been telling people it's a month, and that's a lie.
Month and a half. But to everybody out there, thanks a ton for listening, and remember to keep on winning with dice, and we'll see you next week.
All right, bye guys.
Bye.